What?
Thank you.
Judges, the only reason I have a computer in front of me is because I have the slide and the topic.
That's okay. Always along.
Okay. So today the motion before us is this House, as Monsters, Inc., would abolish the scare ranking. Let's just get into some model first, but essentially what this looks like is essentially a Monsters, Inc., which is like a main power company in Monstropolis, just hires monsters to get scares out of children. Essentially the scare powers the entire city, and what they have currently is a scare ranking, which basically totals the amount of scares and the amount of energy each monster is able to generate, and then based out a ranking out of it. Pretty much self-explanatory, right? Okay, let's move on into our first point on competition, right? First of all, we tell you, just on the basis of a claim, we tell you that competition breeds a lot of toxic culture, right? We tell you that the moment that you rank someone is the moment you begin pitting them against each other. Here's why toxic culture would exist. We tell you that, first of all, extreme competition just builds a divide amongst people. The moment that you're constantly reminded that you are indexed against another means that the board and the ranking just glares at you obviously and measures your worth against and pits you against those of others. What this means and the impacts that it has on others when you see that your worth is in equivalence or in ranking to others, what this means is that you're going to A, get less happiness, B, experience greater stress, and C, your self-worth decreases because your self-worth is solely based on what other monsters are ranked, right? Here's the thing, because of that, you're most likely going to experience burnout, right? You're probably going to be less productive, and because of the fact that you're always constantly so stressed out about what your ranking is, right? We tell you that, in our world, we will tell you that this ranking will play an extreme factor in how you determine your self-worth and why the ranking is so important, because it is something that's shown in the main hall. Everyone sees it every day, walking in and walking out. It's an extremely big deal to be seen as a really good monster and a really good scarer. That's why it's going to be valued so much, right? So we will tell you to experience burnout, and you're going to experience you're obviously going to be less productive because you're so stressed all the time about just trying to be a better scarer and to just receive more points in terms of that, right? But furthermore, as a company, as Monsters, Inc., you're going to receive just more turnover because people are rapidly leaving due to the fact that they're so stressed out all the time about trying to, boost their ranking, right? But second of all, we tell you that this creates a toxic reputation for the company, Monsters, Inc. in general, right? What this means is that this company in general is going to be losing out on a lot of great workers simply due to this burnout that they suffer. And you're going to have a really toxic reputation for the company in general, and people who graduate out of Monsters University will probably not choose this as a job option, right?
Clarification.
Sure.
Is there any alternative model that you'd have to supervise these people, or are they just going out and scaring regardless?
They're just going to continue going out and scaring regardless if they don't have the scare rank. But my partner will clarify if there's anything to do with that. We think ultimately on our side of the house, yes, there might be some kind of decrease in extrinsic motivation when they don't see a ranking. However, we're able to swallow that harm on our side of the house because we fundamentally believe that the happiness that our workers gain on this job is more important because of the fact, and I'll explain this in the point of innovation, because of the fact that they're able actually to be more productive, right? We will take this harm on our side. Secondly, innovation. We think that in general, first of all, it just lessens the encouragement to actually try out new scare methods, right? Because the thing is, if a monster already knows that their scare tactics is extremely well known, or not well known, but extremely well versed and able to produce a lot of scares, they're probably just going to stick to that one tactic and use it over and over again. What this means is that you're not going to get new scare tactics. It's going to run out over time, and the people are just going to be fighting to try to find out what the new scare tactic is, right? We think furthermore, what ends up happening, why it's so important for them is because these monsters are very loss averse, which means that they compare their ranks. So the lesser their rank is compared to like more than their gains. So they weigh their losses more than they weigh their gains, which is why they're going to really care about that and be less encouraged to actually try out new things. But secondly, we tell you what's even more toxic is the fact that there's going to be less sharing of these popular tips, in which it actually creates a lot of scares. We think the moment you create less sharing of tips, there's no incentive to share because of the fact that A, you want to outperform from all of your peers, but B, we tell you that you don't think that they will help you back when you share your tip, right? Like this relates to our whole idea of toxic culture, but more so, the impact is that there's going to be less trading of tips and therefore less experimentation. So there are a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to discover and a lot of techniques and a lot of different energies that might help power the city better than scaring, for example, that people aren't willing to explore anymore, right? We think the comparative is that we get more sharing on our side and more innovation, whereas on their side, you're just going to forever be stuck in that like same tip or that same way of scaring people. Third and final point, the whole idea of female and minorities in Monster Inc., the company. First of all, we tell you that in this established case, there's already very little like female monsters, right? We tell you what ends up happening is the rankings are used as a way to objectively portray why there are so few like female monsters that get hired. Why is this currently happening in status quo, right? I think the small numbers are brought in, like, don't do as well, like, why does this apply? First of all, we tell you there's this whole thing as job culture. Like, overall, Monsters Inc., the moment it was established, focuses primarily on, like, hiring male monsters, right? So when that job culture is already established and entrenched in that company, it's extremely hard to overturn that just by hiring a few female monsters. But furthermore, we tell you it's very unlikely for the females brought in to immediately be able to beat out the best of the best. When you have 100 males versus one female that's brought in, that top 1 male out of 100 is probably going to be able to outperform. But furthermore, just monster minorities, the ability to get screened is, conventionally based on how you look. Like, we just don't agree with that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, awesome. Hello?
So I think what we just heard from Heather was a really interesting speech that would have been really valid in this world. But what I think it completely fails to engage with is the world of Monsters, Inc. Let me tell you what this motion is really about. It's about economics. And it's economics when there's a sole source of energy for the entire city. It is so important. The product that Monsters Inc. is providing is the only framework that is keeping the entire society of monsters up. And I think Heather really fails to properly and seriously engage with this. I like to start with reputation, and following that, I'm going to be building on some constructive points. Going first to reputation. I like to talk about Heather, a lot of Heather's speeches is about how this breeds a competitive, toxic culture. But I don't think she ever mentions, like, why do the scare rankings have to be about promotions? We are going to argue that it's going to be more about public accountability rather than trying to create a toxic corporate culture within the corporation. And I'm going to explain to you why a little bit later. Additionally, as Navin mentioned in her POI, I think a really important part of this, as Heather herself mentioned, is that they're not supervised otherwise. This is the sole source of corporate accountability that exists within this structure. Without it, there's simply no way to measure how well monsters are doing. And again, this is the sole energy source. Without it, the entire society collapses, right? So even if you buy Heather's argumentation that it's creates toxic culture and that makes people feel sad, you have to weigh people feeling sad with the collapse of society. And I think it's very clear which way that goes. When we look at Heather's second argument about less innovation, right? I'm very disappointed in Heather because she's a first-year Bauman student, but clearly she should pay attention to econ because we all know what drives innovation: competition, right? And what is the scare screen doing? Competition. Heather's probably going to say that that contradicts what I said earlier, but I'm going to get into it a little bit later. So competition. So in Heather's model, she says that people are going to be incentivized to keep innovating, but without the scare screen, there is no incentive because there's no form of accountability. There's no reason for me personally to want to do better, and there's no benefit to me doing better. That's just basic logic of economics. Additionally, about the scare screen, she talks about this whole point about women, right? Women monsters are discriminated against in Monsters Inc. And I think Again, that goes back to the issue of public accountability, which we offer on our side. Because what I would rather have, rather than just like, oh my god, like, don't show women, like, I think tacit within Heather's speech is that she thinks that women monsters are inherently worse. Because I would argue public accountability offers public data where we can accurately and objectively see the trends within the data that allow us to more effectively address the issue. So I think on that particular point, I don't understand at all what Heather is saying. No, thank you. So following that, I'm going to make constructive arguments. And as I mentioned before, I think that Heather really fails to frame the motion correctly. And I think this is very, at its heart, an economics motion, and especially important economics motion, because again, there's only one energy source in the society. The 3 points I'm going to bring to you today are about how this increases performance how this increases performance for both the individual and the company. Second, I'm going to talk about public accountability, and the last one is I'm going to talk about resource management. So for my first point, I'm going to talk about how it increases performance, and I'd also like to remind you that like the actor in the scenario is the company, right? We're talking with respect to Monsters Inc. So I think when we look at the importance of driving competition, as I mentioned before, it is competition within, like healthy competition within the structure that allows for driving of competition and innovation, which will increase efficiencies. And again, because this is the only energy source in the society, it's so important to increase efficiency with a growing population, right? As population increases, it needs more energy consumption. So that's why competition is so vital in this particular scenario. Additionally, I think that Heather really fails to mention that fails to address the fact that there are there are ways to combat toxic corporate culture that are available. Like, there's therapists, there's different types of building, and any type of company that is this large has almost a monopoly on the energy sector, definitely has significant economic resources and incentive also to address these issues. So I don't understand this whole issue of toxic culture. So I think on the issue of competition, our side clearly takes the cake. Talking more about competition, I talk now from the perspective of Monsters Inc. As they mentioned in their speech, Monsters Inc. is currently an oligopoly, right? So it is within their best interest to maintain the oligopoly within the economy, especially because this is a sole resource economy. Because of that, they need to, by maintaining resources of the economy, from the perspective of Monsters Inc., it's how they maintain their power, not only economically, but also politically. They don't address at all the fact that Monsters Inc. probably has a lot, as a corporation, probably has a lot of influence due to their basic oligopoly over the sole resource that is keeping their society intact. To maintain this, and again, we're arguing from the actor side of Monsters Inc., it is important that we're able to drive competition, remain competitive, and remain the oligopoly in this situation. The next point of constructive that I'd like to bring up is the issue of public accountability. As Heather herself mentioned, there is no other way to account for accountability without the scare screen. No, thank you. Like, when we see societies like this, where there is a lot of people working for a particular job, there can be the incentive towards social loafing. And this is the one form that we have to defend against that. Because, again, because this is only one resource that is keeping their society afloat, we need everybody to contribute, or else the society will begin to fall apart at the seams. It is the only resource that is allowing the society to continue to prosper. Additionally, we need to look at the extreme importance of this particular job. This is about social responsibility for millions of monsters. Without energy, the lives of millions of sentient beings will be severely compromised, and there is no way to counteract this. How does the PPI know? No? No. Okay. So the final point that I'd like to talk about is the issue of resource management, right? And this is a little bit like economics. See, I'm really flexing my degree here. But when we look at children, right? They are essentially a resource with diminishing returns. Most of the times, monsters are assigned to specific children to repeatedly scare them, right? And what happens when that happens? The more that particular monster scares that children, the less likely to be scared that child becomes as they become accustomed to that monster. These children are diminishing resources to try to support a society that is increasing. The only way to survive in this type of environment with these type of resources is to innovate, and we only get that on our side of the debate. So because of that, this resource management argument is extremely important from the economic perspective to ensure not only the survival of Monsters Inc., but also the entire society of monsters, due to the inherent nature of the only source of energy that they have. Also, an additional extension to that is innovation could be the one way that they find the way out of it. Innovation is how they find maybe a way to more efficiently scale children, find a different energy source. That is why it's so important, because right now they're in a really, really tough situation where they have a single energy source, which is a diminishing resource. So what did I talk to you about today? I reframed the debate in what I think is the most realistic sense. I talked about how it is not about personal feelings, it is about economic incentives and the survival of an entire society. Furthermore, I talked to you about my 3 constructive arguments. I mentioned how this increases performance and that benefits both individuals as well as the company of Monsters Inc., which again, remind you, is the most important actor in this debate. Second of all, I talked about the issue of public accountability and how without the scare screen, there is no public accountability for social loafers and other leeches on society, a society that will deteriorate rapidly without any social accountability due to the fact that it survives purely on a single resource. And my final piece of instructive was about resource management, which is about the inherent nature of this business, where we have a depleting resource with increasing population and the inherent need for innovation, which you only get at our side. Thank you so much.
Good job. Yeah, remember.
There's basically two parts to the case we just heard out of opposition. One is the assertion that this is the only way to pay attention to what monsters are doing, which I don't think is a realistic conception of what Monsters, Inc. looks like when you don't have scare ranking. I'll tell you what that is in a second. And the second part of their case is that we need energy because energy is important, which doesn't clash with what Heather talks about when she says this is going to increase the output of Monsters, Inc., which is our main contention. So I think the importance of generating energy is a reason to vote for government. In that, three things. First, accountability and data. Second, energy production and innovation. And finally, and competition. And finally, innovation. Let's start with accountability. What we hear from Jeffrey is that there's no way to supervise if you don't have these rankings. This is simply not true. I think a good parallel in this case is maybe a clothing store where they work on commission, where they're constantly reminded of how they're performing at the end of each month, where everyone can see that, and their payment and their promotions are uniquely indexed to their performance, versus one in which you're paid by salary, where the number of sales that you have at every single week or every month is not made public for everyone, but your managers still know if you are making literally $0 for the company, right? Like, it's not true that the comparative where you're telling everyone every single week how they do in real time is just, we have no idea what the monsters are doing, right? We can still track what they're doing, we just don't post it in the hall for every single monster to be reminded of every single day, right? That's what we talk about in terms of culture, right? Like, a culture where your manager knows how you're doing is not one that breeds the same kind of competition that we're talking about, and we can totally stand for one where you have accountability. Secondly, that's the accountability point. And then finally, in terms of like the females and minorities point, their response to that is, but you need public data on something, right? Like, no analysis onto what having this public data is going to be used for. But Heather gives you a reason to believe that having the public data is actually harmful. Why? Because you're measuring a system with biased inputs that is going to validate the biased hypotheses that people have, right? The reason why female monsters tend to do poorly in these overall scare rankings is precisely because of the culture that's been there for decades, right? The fact that scaring is overwhelmingly seen as a male-dominated thing, where the only female monsters you see are like secretaries, like Rosalind, and the ones that do get onto the scaring floor are discouraged and shut out by jock culture, or, as Heather points out, it's a numbers game, right? It is like 1 or 10 females competing against a pool of hundreds of male monsters. Probabilistically, you're going to have them not beating all of them, which means that you can use this data not to just like diagnose issues, as Jeffrey says, but to validate post hoc what you think is already true, right? Because it's very easy to demonstrate that they're not performing well, so therefore this is not a place for them. Let's get into the core of this debate then, energy production. Because Jeffrey says we need efficiency, Monsters, Inc. is a monopoly, and you get diminishing returns per child. On efficiency, that is what our case is. We say we generate more screens per monster, we have less turnover. I'll rehash why that is in a second. Secondly, Monsters, Inc. is a monopoly, right? This has nothing to do with external competition, right? Like, if Monsters, Inc. is a monopoly, this doesn't weaken its ability to compete with other companies or other nascent industries, insofar as, once again, it's hung on whether we produce more energy. But finally, in terms of this diminishing returns per child, right? If you really need new ways to scare a child because they're starting to get accustomed to the way that you scare them, then in which world is a monster able to get new innovative techniques from another monster? One in which that monster thinks that if I help this monster by giving them a new way to scare this child that they've been scaring for years, that monster is now going to perform better than me in the scarer rankings, or one in which that monster has no reason not to share that energy or that tip with that other monster. We think that if you genuinely get diminishing returns per child, you need to get rid of the scarer ranking because it significantly discourages the incentive of monsters to share tips with other monsters, as Heather already mentioned. But secondly, we can just move them to a new child, right? Like, if a child starts to get old, you can just put a new monster on a different child. There's no problem with that. So what did Heather say under competition? First of all, she points to the fact that this scarer ranking means you are constantly reminded in real time of your performance. And what does that look like? That means that you as a monster, day in and day out, go do your job. As you leave the room, you look out and you're like, oh, I performed okay, or oh, I performed sort of well. But here's the problem. Only like the top 5 to like 10 monsters are able to actually be satisfied in that scarer rankings or actually lionize. The vast majority of monsters, which are the vast majority of energy producers for this company, feel like crap because they are not beating out those top 10 because only so few can rise to the top, right? Or more likely find themselves slipping. That means that rather than seeing, oh, I really feel validated by my performance and I'm incentivized to do this, after a few months of getting completely destroyed in the rankings, your morale is shot. And note that scaring is not like any other activity where you can do like somewhat mechanically, right? It is hard work. You need to believe that you are scary as a monster in order for that child to believe that you are scary. So if that monster is going in and sees that they're not doing well in the scarer ranking and they're not personally convinced that they're a scary monster, how the hell are they going to convince the child that they are genuinely scary? First, now.
Yeah, do you think that we should like release tabs after tournaments?
Okay, so a couple of things. One, I actually think that maybe at novice tournaments in many different cases, people are discouraged by seeing themselves be like destroyed a lot of the time. Secondly, as Nathan points out, and actually, sorry, as Jeffrey points out, energy production is not like debate. When you do debate, it is something that is important for you and you alone, and you index your performance in its competitive activity. Energy production has a social function. So if it was true that not releasing tabs would lead to better debates overall, that would be good on our side because we would say, like, look, what we care about is not how each individual monster does, but overall aggregate energy production. Given that our analysis is not about how each individual monster improves, but is rather about the fact that we produce more energy, we think that that analogy does not apply. But secondly, Heather talks about the fact that when you have this competitive atmosphere, you increase turnover, right? That means you have to retrain more monsters with people with less institutional knowledge. That happiness is not just about whether monsters feel good, but it is intimately linked to productivity. As I said, you can only convince a child that you're scary, and the response we get, like, we can have therapy, is absolutely ridiculous, right? Given that we diagnose the problem as the scarer ranking itself. We don't have to spend time with therapy, we can stand for that too. Finally, innovation. They say that you need competition to spur innovation. We say a couple of things. One, monsters train hard and identify as monsters and scarers for their entire life. This is something that they want to be good at intrinsically. But when you add the extrinsic motivation of the scarer ranking, as Heather points out, that significantly discourages two things. One, risk aversion, right? Because if you think that you could take a risk that might pay off, but it could lead to a weekly dip in your rankings, monsters are risk averse, they're not likely to want to take that bet. But more importantly, you lose sharing, right? In terms of like marginal gains per child and things like that, monsters have no reason to share with other monsters if they have good tips and tricks. We think that we get more energy produced on our side, and as Monsters Inc., that should be our primary care. We think we only get that if we get rid of the scarer ranking.
Great.
It's really unfortunate that neither Jeffrey nor I have seen this movie in the past decade because I think the guy was able to just like make up a lot of things about the society that we don't really know are true. First of all, I don't necessarily see like systemic like women being like disadvantaged in Monsters Inc. I think they kind of like fiat in that this is like the rhetoric that exists in the human world. I have no idea why that's true in the monsters world. But secondly, they just tell you what the culture is. I don't think that's true, right? I don't think it has to be true that just because you're publishing data means that suddenly people are super toxic and fucking hate each other, right? I don't think every like furniture store that has commission means that people are like at each other's throats, like not sharing sales tactics or being friends, right? They paint this world to you that is like the fucking apocalypse of Monsters Inc., but that's not necessarily what it is, right? They might just be friends that also have this public accountability. I think it leads to a lot of good data, and I think it like stops a lot of social loafing, as Jeffrey tells you. Recognize that they never back their things up with like meaningful empirical data about how we know businesses to actually work. They just tell you that apparently people hate each other and will likely be so scared that they don't want to do anything. Okay, 3 big themes. Firstly, Monsters Inc. Secondly, workers. Thirdly, women and minorities, because somehow that's a part of this debate. Okay, on Monsters Inc. First of all, weighing our case, right? Recognize that the point at which we care purely about the success of Monsters Inc., given that they are the only energy provider for this like whatever world that exists. I think that at the point at which the success of Monsters Inc. is the most important, we don't weigh as much their like analysis on like how people feel. Also note that workers are genuinely consenting to this work. They probably care about competition and like the competition. They can work in a multitude of other jobs if they don't like it, right? Given that that's true, I think there are a lot of people that thrive in competitive environments, people that genuinely thrive in like places where their like work is published or made public, and I think a lot of people thrive in that situation. Secondly though, note that these workers are operating literally behind closed doors, right? That means that it's extremely hard to supervise them. I think one of the few ways that we do it is by measuring their scares. I think that when Ben says, oh no, don't worry, their managers can still keep tabs on you, 1, I don't see how that's necessarily true if you're not using something like a scare meter, but 2, I don't get what their side is anymore then, right? Because if you feel pressure because your manager is still watching you, and you know that your awards and your promotions and everything are still on the line by your performance, literally what is their case, right? At the point at which they have to tell you, no, we still have accountability, no, we still hold rewards over your head if you don't perform well, then they don't get the lack of pressure benefits that they want to claim, right? But note, furthermore, that I think public competition is far better, and that's for a number of reasons. I think that the point at which you are seen not necessarily as a threat to someone when they are at the top, they're far more likely to help you, right? We see that again in debate, right? Where people who are probably very, very good are willing to help other people, right? I don't think they get to fiat in that everyone is so fucking evil in this corporation that they will actively try and like undermine you at every turn. I think people who still compete are very much willing to help other people. Like, that's literally what we see in most competitive environments. I don't see why this is any different. Secondly, then on workers, right? Government paints you a world of like anxiety and toxicity and like literally a terrible work environment. 1, note that this is empirically untrue in companies that literally do this, right? We know that a lot of companies publish public data. We literally know that a lot of companies work on commission, and we don't see people massively suffering as Ben might have you believe. What we do see is increased incentive and increased personal reward, right? 1, I think we probably should reward people that work hard and innovate things, right? But 2, I think it's probably best that you are able to let people engage with how they're performing, right? People being able to get the feedback of knowing, oh, someone else is doing better than me, I should learn something from them, is probably good, right? I got better as a debater by looking at the people that were at the top of the tabs and knowing I should learn something from that person. When that data isn't public, when I don't know who is the best in my society, it's harder for me to learn, it's harder for particularly newer workers to get that kind of knowledge. But also note that Ben completely sloughs off Jeffrey's analysis on why you can likely alleviate this kind of anxiety anyways, right? It's not just about therapy diagnosing the problem, it's about helping people that might be struggling with that pressure, right? I think a lot of pressure, people can learn to cope with that kind of pressure and learn to be able to like be someone who's resilient towards that and work within a competitive environment. Again, we see companies doing that in the modern day, right? If they want to like model this off of like business practices, they need to tell you what actual business looks like. And I think that Jeffrey was the one who does that when he tells you that businesses do very much succeed with these models when they provide like various mental health initiatives for their workers. I think Monsters can do the same. At the end of the day, I think that what we get is better incentive for workers to do that. At the end of Ben's speech, we hear something like slightly confusing, which is that like monsters apparently have an inherent desire to scare. I think if that's like genuinely true, this case is pretty fucking tight because they're likely to do the same thing anyways. So I think there has to be some level of incentive to make them work harder, right? I think at that point you get 1, far more innovation when people know that they want to show off their skills, right? But 2, I think that you can reward them for sharing those innovations as well, right? If we're saying you get a promotion because you were at the top of the scare list, you can also say you get a promotion if you share a really cool idea with your manager who then tells your other workers, right? It doesn't have to be so cut and dry. It doesn't have to be literally the person at the top of the scare list gets it. You can also work with other people. What we think ultimately this does then is shows a public accountability for a lot of different benefits, right? The first is that you reduce social load, right? We know empirically that people, when they know that their work is not being monitored as specifically, or when their peers do not know how they're performing, they are far less likely to perform well. Given, again, the fact that we give you weighing as to why energy is the most important thing in this round, when we tell you that people are unlikely to work as hard when they know they are being watched by their peers, we know that's likely to be true, right? We think that people also will likely know when their friends are struggling, right? I think that if I, as a person who is successfully scaring people, see a friend that I care about struggling on the rating scale or whatever, I'm not going to be a bitch and just be like, I'm so glad they're below me. People aren't that evil, right? I think oftentimes people see their friends struggling and actively want to help them, actively want to improve their performance. I think letting people access that is good. Any POI before 10. Okay, finally then on women and minorities, right? Ben tells you that people can use the rhetoric and or data of people underperforming when they're minorities to weaponize against them. Note that the people that are doing that actually have impact are the people in power. Under Ben's own response then, they have that data anyways. If your manager is watching you and supervising you as Ben tries to defend, they have to lose their women argument because your manager is still going to see you underperforming compared to men and still going to use the same rhetoric, right? What we get on our side is public accountability where actual people, notably actual women, being able to say, hey, I am performing as well, you're just not putting me in the best opportunities, you're not giving me the best kids, etc., right? It's the ability for the public to call out those in power that is the most important. When you have their side, you still have the same amount of rhetoric, you still have the same amount of discrimination, but you don't have the public accountability that shows that women can scare just as well, they're just unable to because they're not given the opportunities and are bullied or whatever, as Ben tells you. At the end of the day, what we get is far better incentives for people to work. What we give you is a far more accurate understanding of what work environments are likely to look like, and ultimately what we tell you is that most people will be included by this level. People have consented to work in this environment. I think at that point, we maximize their productivity and maximize their experience. So proud to those.
Okay. Yellow again.
Okay, so what do we get from this round? I think there's three main things that I'm going to address. The first one is going to be nature of competition. The second one is going to be about innovation. And the third theme is going to be about energy production. So the first thing I'm going to engage with is the nature of competition. And I think that the only response that we get from side gut is basically there's different alternatives, the managers can do that. But I think it really fails to have any in-depth analysis. If you think about it, what is the manager going to base your performance off of? Probably the average of the company, right? In this type of scenario, there's still going to be competition among people. It's not going to be, it's just not going to be explicit. So what we're doing, so basically what happens is that there could still be competition and all the negative side effects that they mentioned, but it would be less efficient than our side, where it's more explicit and open. Talking about innovation, I think that they try to address this point in very circular logic, because basically they say in response to what I said about diminishing returns per child, they said people can innovate because they'll like each other. But as Navin mentioned, we already get that on our side as well. But even if that's not true, they fail to establish any incentive in this scenario. If anything, there's still less incentive than on our side. And I think because of this, when we look at the weighing of this particular point, on our side we sort of get both innovations. We get the likelihood that people will still collaborate because people aren't inherently assholes, and as well as the personal incentive to improve your score purely because you feel like you might want to do better. We get both of that on our side. Versus on their side, they might maybe only get one, but that's still not necessarily true. The final point I like to talk about, I think, is the most important because they completely fail to address it, which is the nature of the society, which is that there is a sole energy resource and it is extremely important. And I don't think they ever fail to understand how serious this is. I think when I mentioned the counter to what Heather said about this toxic cultural environment, I think Ben very flippantly dismisses what I say. Because when we talk about therapy, this is a real thing that companies use. And they use this because there's profit incentive for them to make sure their workers are healthy. And especially in this scenario, because there's also societal incentive. Because this is what keeps society running, right? There's going to be a lot of incentive for them to make sure that their workers are healthy and happy. In this case, therapy is not purely a diagnostic tool for the problem. It is also the cure for the problem as well. So what we see on this side is that literally in their best case scenario, we got people say you think therapy is only purely mitigatory for these toxic effects. We get people being slightly sad versus the insane loss of innovation, efficiency, and productivity for the society's most important resource. And I think when you weigh these two options, people being maybe slightly sad but still having therapy available versus the potential complete deterioration of this important resource within society, I think it's very clear why this point is extremely important and goes completely unaddressed addressed by SciGov. So I think when you look at the three themes that I brought to you, the nature of competition, innovation, as well as energy production, I think it's very clear that due to the complete failure to engage with the nature of this motion and the seriousness of energy production in this particular world that they have set up themselves, that's why they lose the debate. Because they have not addressed the nature of competition, economics, and incentive within this particular environment where there's a sole energy resource that is keeping the entire nature of society afloat. Thank you.
I just find it extremely funny that Jeffrey comes up here and tells us about therapy in regular offices when, let's just read that over again. Therapy already happens in regular offices where rankings aren't even used. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's just imagine if rankings were used, especially when it's for a resource that's so valued and needed in the very society. Okay, really two things that's gonna happen in my summary. So I'm just going to analyze the whole thing of competition versus innovation and whether or not we can get both, or if one side's going to be lacking in the other. And secondly, discrimination, but mainly competition and innovation, right? Firstly, let me just pick up on the fact that side opposition really just didn't deal with our whole analysis of workers in Monsters Inc., where we've told you that they suffer from burnout, they suffer from stress, they suffer from all these mental issues due to the fact that they're seeing their rankings every single day. We think that what's happening is with their whole debater thing, they see it once and then they forget it. And oftentimes with the debater analysis is that the pro ends up going with the am. The reason why a pro doesn't necessarily always help a pro is because of the fact that they don't want to just help each other. This is a competition. They're trying to beat each other out. Why would a pro have any incentive to help a pro? That's why they help someone who's definitely not within their range of threat, right? But furthermore, we tell you that all regular companies don't see their rankings slammed into their face on a daily basis. They see it maybe in a newspaper once. This is an extremely big separation that we want to point out on our side of the house. But furthermore, we tell you that on their side of the house, this extreme competition, we've already told you in my speech many times, right? It leads to burnout, which means you get less productive workers, which means that people end up leaving, which means that you have to train more people. All this comes at a cost to your company, which means you're losing all your workers and you're losing the best of the best. You're going to be less productive on their side of the house with more competition simply because of the way the rankings are built, right? If this was a regular company with no rankings, yeah, competition leads to innovation. But because this kind of competition is so extreme that it forces you to literally look at a number beside your name, that is the toxic environment that we do not condone outside proposition, right? So we think on their side of the house, high competition, lack of innovation. On our side of the house, we're willing to swallow the fact that we might not get as much extrinsic support and competition, right? But we're fine with that because in a regular office working environment, you're already kind of looking out for people. You're looking out for others. Your manager's already, looking out for you and looking at what you're doing. You're still going to have competition on our side of the house. But furthermore, we're going to get innovation because people aren't pitted against each other, because they don't see number 1 and number 5. Instead, they see, this is my friend Bob, I'm going to work with Bob, because we are workers in an environment and we are not number 1 and number 5, right? We're not trying to close the gap. That's why I'm more willing to work with them. That's why you're going to get innovation on our side of the house and less competition so that it's an actual healthy working competition so that our workers don't drop out within 2 months of working at Monsters Inc., right? Our workers, our scary monsters are going to stay there because of the fact that they actually like working in the environment, because they're not suffering from burnout, because of the fact that they're not tired all the time. But let's move on to discrimination, right? We tell you that furthermore, on their side of the house, they're going to have biased data. I already really flushed it out in my case, but just once again, biased data occurs because of the fact that they take very few female monsters or female scarers and put them in the company and pit them against the best of the best, which means you're obviously going to have data that doesn't accurately reflect how well female monsters actually are able to scare. Furthermore, you're not going to be able to provide as much resources for them because of the fact that they are relatively low on the rankings. On our side of the house, we prefer no data over biased data. We think it's better if we're able to actually train and help our employees, and then when they're able to be really good scarers, well, we promote them as really good scarers and actually help solve this discrimination, right? On our side of the house, we're able to guarantee both competition and innovation. On their side of the house, they only guarantee competition and literal lack of innovation because every single one of their employees are burnt out and stressed. So proud to propose.
Okay, good job, everybody. Shake hands outside. We'll call you back in.
Oh, it's open?